pleasure to introduce Ken Egan. After teaching American literature at colleges and universities in the United States and abroad, Ken served as the executive director of Humanities Montana for 11 years. He has published 5 books on literature and history, including Hope and Dread in Montana Literature and Montana 1889. I see you like the title of Montana on the date.
I do, I really do. I stole that though.
You stole that. You have it copyrighted.
Can't do it, can't copyright titles.
And the 1864 was entitled Indians, Immigrants, and Gold in the Territorial Year. And it was a finalist for the High Plains Book Award in nonfiction. He is currently writing a biography of his Irish-American great-grandfather, who served through some of the most dramatic events of the 19th century. Is this the book you were mentioning a few minutes ago?
Exactly, and it's yeah, it's, can you all hear me? I have to check. You can, excellent. So I'm very excited about this book. It's now under review by a university press that will go nameless, but my great-grandfather, hard to believe it's only my great-grandfather, emigrated to the States in 1851. And he was a rowdy rascal of a guy, and so he broke free from his family, went to Japan in 1857, which is just a few years after Perry, and we have a lot of great documentation on that. Then he joined the Union Army and marched to the sea with Sherman, so that was an extraordinary time, and we have all kinds of dense kind of first-person accounts of that. And then he and his family homesteaded right where the Ingalls family, you might remember a certain Laura Ingalls Wilder, very close to where they homesteaded in Minnesota. So it's a book about immigration itself, the Irish-American experience, and an attempt really to kind of, frankly, build some sympathy for immigrants. Most of us are immigrants. Most of us came here, and I'm trying to kind of delve into what that was like for one 19th century American guy. So that's what it is. So, yeah. Should I go from there? Yes. Are we ready? Fired up. Good to see you all. Thank you for coming. What a great turnout on the cusp of the Brawl of the Wild. I hope you noticed. I worked on it, got some Grizz colors going. I actually have the original Grizz colors on a sweatshirt from 1995, but I noticed it's all holy and it's maybe a little overused, so I couldn't wear that tonight. But go Grizz. I'm going to say it. I hope you're okay with that. Thank you for being here. I love giving this talk. As I'm going to tell you in a moment, this is a book very near and dear to my heart. That is 1864. It actually began with my work at Humanities Montana, and I was thinking about ways to possibly raise money for our good cause. We were talking about how our Speakers Bureau pays for speakers to go into schools, into organizations, into nonprofit groups, and we have to raise money to do that. And so as we're approaching the territorial year, that is the sesquicentennial, I hate saying that, but anyway, as sesquicentennial, 150th anniversary of Montana Territory, I thought, how could we raise money? Well, I love writing, so I said, I'm going to try writing a history book about 1864, and that's what I did. I really lucked out. The publisher I worked with is Riverbend Publishing, Chris Cobble. Chris has actually sold out, so to speak, I don't mean it in a negative way, to a larger publisher now, but Chris is a phenomenal publisher. He took this project to heart and helped me produce it, and so very, very proud of it. Now, I just want to remind, a number of you already know this, but I actually have 2 Montana history books. After 1864 came out and did quite well, Chris approached me, Chris Cobble, and said, hey, Ken, what about the year of statehood? Maybe you should see what happened 25 years later. So I went ahead and produced 1889, and they are truly companion texts. I do think of them as gateways to Montana history, and in fact, I sometimes say they're gateway drugs to Montana history, by which I mean I hope the stories, these vignettes, are so fetching, so engaging, that you find yourself curious and you want to explore much more deeply. They've been used on occasion in schools, and I find students particularly are kind of drawn to them. Because again, just to explain the format of each book, they're told month by month, and then you have 3 or 4 vignettes under each month. And the theory is it's a kind of montage, a kind of collage, and that you see how these episodes kind of interlink as you go forward through each book. And so it has dense references at the back, so you can pick those up. I also do have a website, www.montana1864.com. I'll say it again, www.montana1864.com. And you can find out a lot more information about both books at that website. All right. Many of you here, I know, are researchers, writers, or just flat out history buffs, right? And I guess I'm always curious about where projects begin. What is it that triggers a book? Now, I've just said, yeah, I wanted to write a book to raise funds for my nonprofit, Humanities Montana. But it was more than that. When we approached the 150th anniversary of Montana Territory, my mind, my memories, my senses went right back to 1964. 1964, the 100th anniversary of Montana Territory. Why did that happen? How many of you knew about the Montana Centennial train in 1964? A good number. Did you guys actually see the train? Anybody? You saw it. Where'd you see the train? I'm curious. Glendive, very good. What'd you think? What'd you think? Yeah, very, very cool. And others who raised their hand, did you go to the train? Yeah, exactly, same thing, yeah. So here's the deal. I was born in Polson. We spent my first 3 years here in Montana. And then my dad thought, there's money to be made in real estate outside Chicago. And actually, that dream didn't pan out. But it was a good idea, I guess. Anyway, so Dad took all of us, that is 6 children and my mother, and we moved to a suburb of Chicago. So in 1964, we're actually in a suburb of Chicago. My grandmother's living with us. She was a homesteader in Montana back in the 19-teens. So she saw the train was coming through Chicago, and she said, kids, you've got to see this train. We've got to do this. So God bless grandmother. She got us all dressed up, and we got on a train. We went into Chicago. We were not well-behaved children, I will add immediately. My grandmother, I'll say God bless her, she endured. She was patient. She got us to this train, and it blew my mind. I was just 7 years old. Really blew my mind. It really did, because you walked onto the train, and it was, I think, primarily 3 cars of displays, and there were gold nuggets, and there were big old buffalo hides, and there were enormous paintings. The painting that always comes back to my mind, it was a painting of Custer's Last Stand, and it was actually J.K. Ralston's After the Battle, which is a pretty grisly painting. And if you're a 7-year-old kid, you love that stuff. So I love that. I really love that. Anyway, so as I was dreaming about, thinking about writing a book about the 150th anniversary of Montana Territory, the thought that entered my head is maybe I could create a virtual Centennial train through a book. So in a sense, that's what I'm offering, and those of you who've got your hands on it, you could tell me whether it works or not, whether in fact it is that. Now, before we launch into a series of stories, I do want to introduce you to this map. Again, all credit to Chris Cobble and his brilliant daughter-in-law. This is a map of Montana 1864. And I guess I'll just ask you, any initial impressions of that map? Anything strike you about the map as you glance? Just glance at it. Anything hit you about it? Yes, sir. Interesting. Okay, very good. Very good. So you're probably thinking here of St. Ignatius, Helena, Butte, Bozeman, and all of these emerge in the course of 1864. And we'll touch on that a little bit. Very good. Any other reactions? Any thoughts? Yes, the rivers are so critical, aren't they? The rivers are absolutely critical to accessing Montana and settling in Montana. You bet. Yes, and I'll be honest with you, if I could do the map over again, I think I would make them a little bolder. But Chris and I talked through that, and what we're showing is that 1864 was a truly transformative moment for the indigenous people who lived in this region. and I'll show you the numbers in a second. They're kind of startling. That is the number of non-Indians who arrive in this area. But these are the primary tribal nations and their homelands, the Kootenai, the Pend Oreille, of course, the Salish and the Bitterroot, and you can read across there. Let me emphasize that you have a series of primary routes into, goody, I could do this. We have really just a few primary routes into what will become Montana, and you have to imagine this incredible flow of humanity coming in. So we have the northern overland route from Minnesota, led by James Fisk, right? You have the Missouri River itself, which is a key way people come in to Montana. You have the Bozeman Trail here. You have what's called the Bridger Cutoff here. Jim Bridger trying to figure out an alternative route that would cause less conflict with Indians than the Bozeman Trail. By the way, it didn't work out. It's too dry. We don't mark it very well, but you have the Corinne Trail coming up over Oneida Pass. And coming in from the west was much more difficult. So you have mining camps blowing up in Bannock, in Virginia City, in Helena come July, right? And then you have communities like Bozeman emerging basically to supply agricultural goods for all of these outlanders moving into the country. We already have in place what's called the Sun River Indian Farm. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a second. And then we have up here St. Ignatius, and of course our very own Missoula emerges in November of 1864, and we'll see how that happens. So, what I'm also struck by, though, is the emptiness out here, if you will. Of course, it's not empty. There are tribal peoples who occupy and use that land, but in terms of communities, not a lot out there. All right, year of transformation. So here are some of the stats, some of the figures we can work with. So Montana formally became a territory May 26, 1864. And by the way, many of you know a lot of this, and feel free to fill in, or if I misstate something, please just jump in and ask a question or comment. And you understand that Montana has created a territory because the Republican government of Abraham Lincoln, with a Republican-controlled Congress, is desperate to try to claim this area for the Union cause. They're very aware that a lot of Confederate sympathizers, ex-Confederate soldiers, etc., are flowing into Montana, going toward those gold mining camps, or settling in a place like Bozeman to establish a ranch or farm. So Lincoln is very intentional, along with his allies in Congress, to try to demarcate these spaces as Republican. This is the number that blows me away. We commonly believe, and I tend to think this is true, there may have been as few as 100 whites living in Montana in 1861 when the Civil War began. By 1864, you have probably around 20,000. Imagine the impact of all that humanity rushing into Montana along those various trails we just pointed out. It's commonly believed as well, the best estimate is there were about 20,000 indigenous people as well, but you go from a 20,000 to 100 ratio to a par. And you know, a lot of the guys and gals coming in are not nice people, they're not gentle souls, as we'll discover soon. Many of them were violent. I got to tell you, you guys know this if you've read about it, Montana 1864 was a pretty violent place. Downright scary, actually. When I did the big tour in 2014, 2015, I was often asked, Ken, would you go back to 1864? And my immediate reaction is, no way, I would not go back. I wouldn't survive. And so the towns of Bozeman, Butte, Helena, and Missoula all emerge during 1864. By the way, you probably know this, but Butte began as a gold mining camp. And then someone discovered this thing, this silver, and then they discovered copper, and that kind of changed everything. And then finally, the first laws are establish white voting rights and hint at future dealing with tribes. And again, I'll fill all that in as we go. Now, to give you the flavor of the place, I hope that text is large enough. remember, we cannot forget it's the Civil War. We cannot forget that politics, that Union versus Confederate, it seeps into, infiltrates every relationship, every gesture, every action. It really does. And I thought the best way to show that would be to take you to Fort Benton. It's July 4th, 1864. It's the Independence Day. It's the day we celebrate America, the creation of the United States of America. And here's what's going on in Fort Benton. And this, by the way, is from William Gladstone, who obviously was living in Fort Benton. He is an ancestor of our own Jack Gladstone. So there's kind of an interesting connection there. Jack Gladstone, the great songwriter and singer. Here's what William Gladstone saw on July 4th, 1864. I shall never forget the 4th of July in Benton. Most of the men were from the Southern Army, and their hatred of the North expressed itself in an unmistakable way. There were 1,500 men in Benton at that time, and I saw such desperate characters as the James brothers among them. I've tried to confirm that, can't confirm it, but it's such a good story, I believe it. I'm going to take it. I like the story. You can imagine the fights and rows that went on that day. With feelings of mutual hate inflamed by bad whiskey, the men of the North and South were only too eager to come to blows. It was hell upon earth for a time. And that's just one moment in many, many moments of the conflict. And as you know, right at the heart of Montana history, Montana culture, Montana memory is this ongoing north-south divide. It is still with us, I believe. We could have a good discussion of that probably. But in any case, it's very much alive in Fort Benton in 1864. Now, we're on the cusp of Thanksgiving, so I thought I should tell a Thanksgiving story. And so I'm cheating a little bit. I'm going back a year earlier than 64, but I think you'll like the story. How many of you have been to Bannock? I bet most of you have been to Bannock. Yeah. Doesn't look that different from this photograph, does it? Just to be clear, this photograph is from, we think, 1865. So it's truly a, I think a fascinating insight. And a little bit later, we'll see Virginia City. It has a different vibe, doesn't it? But look at all those wooden structures. Look at all those trains, those horse trains going through. You sense a town on the move, in motion, unstable, not fully developed. It's rough and tumble. And that is truly the town we're going to spend time with. So I want you to cast your mind back. It's November 1863, Thanksgiving. We're in a small cabin in Bannock. The owners of the cabin, I put owners because they're really leasing it in a way, are James and Martha Jane Vale. They are missionaries who came up the Missouri River, and they were hanging out at Sun River Indian Farm. You might remember I pointed to that. And their goal was to convert the Indians to Christianity and agriculture. It didn't go well, so they retreated to Bannock. Well, they're in Bannock, and they're actually hanging out with, in the case of Martha Jane, a brother-in-law by the name of Henry Plummer. And I know y'all heard of Henry Plummer. So Henry Plummer, the previous summer, had married none other than Electa Bryan, Martha Jane's sister. So we also have present, well, a couple other fellows I think you'll recognize. Let's advance here. Here we go. So in this small cabin, Thanksgiving, 1863, we have Henry Plummer. We'll get it. I'm going to show you an image of what I hope he looked like, but I don't know if he really looked like it. But these are actual photos, we believe, authentic images of two diehard Republicans. On the left, we have Sidney Edgerton, who will soon be appointed as the governor of Montana. We'll have more to say about Sidney shortly. But Sidney ended up in Bannock. He was supposed to go all the way to Lewiston, Idaho. He was supposed to be the Chief Justice of Idaho Territory. He stops in Bannock. And to this day, it's a puzzling decision. He said, hey, winter was coming on. I couldn't get over to Lewiston. It's a long way away. It was September. It was early September. He could have gone to Lewiston. So we think he was already thinking of carving a new territory, what became Montana, out of Idaho. Sidney is an absolutely diehard abolitionist. That is so important to keep in mind. he actually tried to see John Brown. After John Brown raided at Harper's Ferry, right, and is in prison and is going to die, Sidney Edgerton goes all the way from Ohio to see John Brown to see if he can comfort him. Now, they don't let him in because they don't trust Sidney Edgerton, but it tells you how ardent a Republican he was. And just to remind you, I know you guys know this, but Republican, Democrat, it's almost like we have to flip those terms from our current use of them, if you know what I mean. Anyway, Wilbur Sanders is his nephew. He's also a lawyer. And Wilbur Sanders is every bit as ardent an abolitionist as his uncle. He will turn out to be extremely important with the Vigilantes. And then he has a long, long career in Montana. Pretty phenomenal. One of my favorite parts of writing the next book, 1889, was to discover just how interesting Sanders' life was. Turned out to be the kind of lawyer who represented the underdogs, those who were excluded. He was very, very committed to helping the Chinese in Montana, for example. Okay, so they're in the cabin, right? So we got these guys in the cabin. Kind of thought you'd get a kick out of this quote. So this is Sidney Edgerton's daughter. This is her memoir, her memory of arriving in Bannock. And if the photo didn't give you an idea of how rough and tumble Bannock is, check this out. Shortly after arriving at Bannock, my father strolled up Main Street to see the town. Coming to a building where miners' court was in progress, he went in. The judge, seeing that he was a stranger, invited my father to sit beside him. By the way, one of the oddities of Sidney Edgerton is he is appointed the Chief Justice of Idaho Territory. He should be declaring that status, but he hides it. We're also curious about that. I don't know what to make of that. Anyway, the trial of the case proceeded, but not for long, when it was interrupted by the suggestion that someone present, that it was time liquid refreshments should be served. When the liquor was exhausted and the court and those in attendance upon it sufficiently stimulated, the trial went on, only to meet with a similar interruption in the course of half an hour. So, this was the initiation of the new Chief Justice into Western methods of legal procedure. Okay. That was a rough and tumble frontier town. That's what we're saying, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing. All right, are you ready? Here it is. Henry Plummer, Democrat and killer. Can I tell you the truth? We don't think this is really a photo of Henry Plummer, but I like it so much I decided to use it. I'm sorry. My good friends at the Montana Historical Society have told me more than once, Ken, that is not Henry. Well, let me be clear. We don't know if it's Henry Plummer. They can't authenticate it. I think it's what Henry Plummer should look like. That's what I'm saying. Okay. Anyway, it is important he's a Democrat. As many of you probably know, there is a theory that the reason Henry Plummer is killed, is hanged, is lynched, is because he was a Democrat in the midst of all these diehard, ardent, abolitionist Republicans. There is that theory. I will tell you, though, that the best biographies of Plummer suggest he was not in favor of slavery. He was a Union Democrat, so not so sure. Henry Plummer had an extraordinary, troubled life. Born in Maine, he goes to California at the very end of the gold rush. He arrives in California about 1852. He starts out being quite respectable. He's actually an ad man for a bakery in Northern California. But slowly, you can feel his morals eroding. He becomes caught up in what they called saloon and bordello crowd. Ultimately, we can document he killed 4 people in California. And 2 of those murders seem pretty darn cold-blooded, all right? He ends up escaping from California after spending a little time in prison. He ends up in Idaho Territory. He's actually going to go back to the States. He's decided he's leaving. He's getting out of the West. And what happens is James Vail, remember James and Martha Vail are the hosts on that Thanksgiving evening, right? James goes to Fort Benton, meets Plummer and says, I'm afraid for my family. Please come to the Sun River Indian Farm. Protect us from Indians. Lo and behold, Plummer arrives at the Sun River Indian Farm, falls in love with Electa. She falls in love with him. Electa, by the way, is much younger, described as quite naive. Anyway, they end up getting married, but just before James and Martha come to Bannock, Electa flees for Iowa. What is going on? We don't know. We suspect Electa figured out Plummer was a nefarious dude. All right. So that Thanksgiving evening, before I describe the lynching, that Thanksgiving evening, Plummer had bought a 40-pound turkey from Salt Lake. Plummer had bought cigars. He'd bought wine. He was hosting Sidney and Wilbur and another very important man named Francis Thompson. And it was clear that Plummer was trying to soften them up. It was clear that he was trying to get into their good graces. Did not work, sadly. And Plummer ends up getting lynched in early evening on January 10th, 1864. You'll pardon this image. It's a little cheesy, but I kind of like it. So that's me standing at the gallows. This is, I think, 2015. And trying to look, I don't know, like a dude or something. But whatever. This is where Plummer was lynched along with two others. And you understand, he was convicted in an extra-legal fashion by the vigilantes of running a road gang that was murdering people and stealing gold. And to me, this is always an extraordinary moment. We can really see it, and I try to describe it carefully in 1864, the book. But you have to imagine, it's a cold, bitter cold day on January 10th, and Plummer is under the weather. He's reclined on a couch, we learn. He normally carries weapons, but he's set them aside. The vigilantes show up, totally out of the blue. He's taken off guard. They march him out. They march him to this post with two others. And as he's going out the door, Wilbur Sanders' cabin is right there. And Henry believes he and Wilbur Sanders are friends. He believes Sanders can save him. What he doesn't know is Sanders was the primary motivator for the vigilantes. But here are the famous words Wilbur Sanders spoke as Plummer's being dragged off to be hanged. It is useless for you, Henry, to beg for your life. The affair is settled. My apologies. The affair is settled and cannot be altered. You are to be hanged. And this is the line that always kind of does it for me. Do you think this is true? You cannot feel harder about it than I do. Wilbur Sanders is standing on the porch of his cabin. He's going to go back in, by the fire, have a cigar, whereas Henry's being dragged off to be hanged. I think it feels harder to Henry. I'm just guessing. But I cannot help it if I could. But he didn't want to help it. He believed Plummer was guilty. Now, I'm just curious. Many of you, I think, have probably gotten into the Plummer case. How many of you think Henry was justly hanged? Do we have a show of hands? Okay, that's a pretty good number. See, 5, 6. How many think he was unjustly hanged? Do we have any advocates here? One. Okay, very good. Why do you think that, by the way? Why do you think? All right. Oh, basically she read the book and thought it made a persuasive argument. So that's it. So. All right, here we go. We're now plunging into actual 1864, which I promised to talk about, right? And I like to begin each section. I'm going to focus on November and December. And I like to begin each with an excerpt from the Blackfeet calendar. This is a really beautiful set of entries. And what I really love about these entries is they locate us in place. You can tell that for the Blackfeet, the Pecuni, the Pagan, this is home. This place is home. We know that because of, look at the specificity of this entry. November is the moon to knock bullberries off of their thorny bushes. Cold and frost really turns them for the sweetness, turns them on for the sweetness. All animal hair is prime in November. Trapping begins for those early ancestors of ours. The eagle goes on its southern migration. Ice covers most waters. Right? They're in place. They live here. They know this place. In contrast, you have all of these aggressive, anxious, greedy people flowing in against that. So, I'm just going to follow up now on some of the little strands that we've already pursued. So this then is an excerpt from the Montana Post. And you have to understand the Montana Post is edited, first Montana newspaper, edited by Thomas Dimsdale, who is an ardent Republican. So in other words, he's in alignment with Sanders and Edgerton. And he's always going to support the Union cause. So they have an election for the first territorial representative to Congress. So this is November 1864. And unfortunately for the Republican cause, a Democrat, Samuel McLean, defeats Sanders. And in fact, Sanders is thwarted in his effort to get to Congress for another almost 30 years. Sanders does not get to Congress until 1890. He's only there 4 years. He's effectively voted out. But this was a very bitter pill to swallow. Again, we're in the middle of the Civil War. For Sanders, this is a moral, not just a political cause. He wants to show Montana is loyal to the Union. And what do we get? So I'll just read to you. I know you can't read that text. So the Union Party were outnumbered at the polls in this neighborhood and in some other places. And if, on the receipt of all the returns now so shortly expected, on the total summary of legal votes, there be no countervailing majority, the Union men must acknowledge a defeat. Whether, however, defeat or a success shall be proclaimed within the next few days, the politics of the party and the unswerving determination to abide by the flag and the Union will know no change. We will remain loyal to the Union. We believe in the destruction of slavery. We will not, give any quarter. We are going to continue to support our cause. Now, what's interesting is I'm going to flash forward just a couple of years. Many of you know about Thomas Francis Meagher, right? I mentioned my great-grandfather, very Irish. He and Meagher had kind of similar lives. Anyway, Meagher arrives in Montana and is named the secretary in 1865. Well, Edgerton will leave the area, the territory, and Sanders then becomes seen as kind of the head of the Republican faction in Montana. There is a great deal of thought, I don't know if I believe it, that Sanders is responsible for the death of Thomas Francis Meagher in 1867. I'm just planting the thought, just something for you to think about. But anyway, so this is one of the key events in November of 1864. The founding of our town, 1864, November. We know that Higgins, Pattee, and Worden begin building the Missoula Mill, and it's right at the intersections where the Rattlesnake flows into the Clark Fork River. By the way, it wasn't called the Clark Fork River then. It was the Hellgate River, which is kind of interesting. And you have a lovely photo of me there posed with the original mill wheel. So this is the mill wheel they used in 1864. This was a massive development for this region. And in a moment, we'll see why and why this was the moment it turned into a town. This, of course, is C.P. Higgins, another Irishman. Can't get enough of them. Another Irish immigrant. And C.P. arrives in Montana, what becomes Montana, I should say, in 1855 with Isaac Stevens. They have a big treaty ceremony at Council Groves. And Higgins realizes there may be commercial opportunities here. So Higgins ends up partnering with Worden. They actually run a freighting business out of Walla Walla, Washington. And then they establish their first trading business in a town called Hellgate, 4 miles, basically about 4 miles west of us here. And so you can see what their first trading post looked like. There it is. That was it. That was the Worden and Company store at Hellgate. And that is Frank Woody standing in front. You meet a lot of great characters doing historical research. Frank Woody's one of my favorites. He's just a character. He turns out to be a judge. He's very important to the region, lives a long life, but he's also kind of a smart aleck and kind of funny. But there's Frank in front of this original Hellgate store. That is, if you will, the incubator for Missoula, what becomes Missoula. And here's what Frank Woody testified to. Why does Missoula emerge in 1864? Pretty obvious. 20,000 people flowing in. They need goods. They need the implements for their agriculture. They need the means to mine, right? And so here's what Frank Woody says. The Kootenai mines having been discovered early in the spring of this year, hundreds of men flocked to them, passing by the village of Hellgate. This stampede created a demand for all kinds of supplies and everything sold at war prices. In the fall of '64, the ruling price for wheat was from $4 to $5 per bushel, and these high prices were caused by the immense number of people who had flocked to the mines of alder and other cultures. So there you have it. So Missoula is born this month, 1864. Now, we're turning to an incredibly grim event, and in some ways you might wonder, why am I bringing this up? There's so much going on in Montana. Why actually shift to a grim event in Colorado? I'll explain that shortly, but I assume most of you know about the Sand Creek Massacre. Just an absolutely, utterly horrific event. What is maddening about it, in part, is that Colonel Shivington with 700 militiamen, Colorado militiamen, attacked the camp of a friendly Cheyenne chief, Black Kettle. Black Kettle, in fact, had located his camp on Sand Creek with the intention of entering into treaty with the whites. He saw the future coming. He did not want to engage in warfare with the invaders. But Shivington attacks his camp. They end up killing probably around 163 Cheyenne, many of the women and children. And you probably remember Shivington's most famous line, right? He famously said, "Nits make lice." Nits make lice, that is, baby lice kill them all. That was Shivington's instruction. Horrific event. Why does this matter to Montana? Because an extraordinary young lady arrives in Montana. She is with the Southern Cheyenne, and she's 11 years old. She barely survives the fighting, and she flees north, and she actually goes all the way up to Chief Dolknife's camp on the Tongue or Powder River, right on the Yellowstone there. And she is an extraordinary young person. This is an image from when she's 17 or 18. I think we're so lucky to have it. She became a mother. She became a dedicated member of the Northern Cheyenne. And perhaps most famously, she was the last one, we believe, to touch Custer before he died. So she's famous as counting coup on Custer just before his death. She's part of a group of Cheyenne women who attack him and end his life. That's at least the story we believe. Sorry to report that she ends up dying probably from consumption when she's just 20, which is always a heartbreaker. But you can see how events, even as far south as Colorado, are flowing up. And please understand, there are other Indian-white conflicts happening. In western Dakota, you have an army unit, a large army unit, led by Sully, attacking the Dakota and Lakota in North Dakota, right? So we have that happening. And we already have conflict along the Bozeman Trail, right? Which, the indigenous people see what's happening. They're trying to stop it. So this really is just another element, if you will, another instance, another kind of provocation for Indian-white conflict in our region. We now turn to December. December is the moon of winter cold. It's also the moon that parts her hair right square in the middle. I love that. This is because of the days, the shortest days, and the beginning of the longer days. Of course, it's winter solstice, right? I love that. So. All right. We're shifting now to Virginia City. Very different look, right, from Bannock. Look how different that is. Roughly the same time period. They're building with brick. There's a lot more money here. As you know, probably, Alder Gulch was the mother lode. It was huge. It's often compared to California in scale. It was on a totally different scale from Bannock or Helena or any of the major mines in the region, or mining areas. So there is Virginia City. I like the fact we're viewing it from Cemetery Hill. I hope y'all have been to Virginia City. That's the right place to look at Virginia City. What's happening here? Well, we now have a new Chief Justice for Montana Territory, Hezekiah Hosmer, appointed by Lincoln. He is a diehard Republican. You notice the trend here. So the Lincoln administration is appointing these abolitionist radical Republicans, whereas members of the electorate are voting in Democrats who are often sympathetic to the South. Interesting. So Hosmer takes it as his first job as Chief Justice to put those vigilantes in their place. It has to stop, he believes. We cannot have extra legal proceedings going on while I'm trying to build essentially a justice system, a legal system in Montana. And I'll let you read this particular quote. Basically, this is what I call the softening statement by Hosmer. Just to be clear, he's addressing a number of vigilantes and other citizens in the Planter Hotel in Virginia City on January 5th, 1864. Excuse me, December 5th, 1864. And what he's saying in so many words is, okay, I get it. It was necessary for y'all to hang some people. It was dangerous. You did the right thing. I admire that. Good for you. And then he says, much as we may approve the means of self-protection thus employed and the promptitude with which they are applied, our administration ceases when they assert an authority defiant of law and usurp offices which belong only to government itself. To me, this is one of those fascinating hinge moments in Montana history where you have a public official saying, we are now going to impose order. We are going to figure out what's actually legal and extra legal. We will be responsible, the government and our legal apparatus, we will be responsible for punishing. We're not stringing up any more Henry Plumbers, okay? We're not doing that. We give them all, the vigilantes, all the credit they deserve by according them praise for what they have accomplished. But they have fulfilled their work. Remember, guys, he's addressing vigilantes directly in person. His son, who wrote this biographical sketch, believed that his father was under immediate threat and danger as he's speaking these words. By the way, Hosmer did stay in Montana till 1872. So he was not executed, thank goodness. But this was a brave thing he did. To go farther is to commit crime and undo what has been done, so well done. Let us then erect no more impromptu scaffolds. Let us inflict no more midnight executions. By the way, how effective was this? Did vigilante justice stop in 1864 just because Hezekiah Hosmer said so? No. A heck of a lot more hangings, lynchings occur all the way up through the 1880s. So sad to report that. Now, this is probably a more little-known fact, but the Sisters of Providence established their first Catholic school for girls at St. Ignatius in December of 1864. It's widely believed that they were the first white women to cross into Montana territory from the west. There are 4 of them. I bet a lot of you, many of you have been up to St. Ignatius and seen this cabin? This cabin that was built in 18, yes. So this is their cabin. And I'll just tell you what the sign on it says here. This house, built in 1864, was the first residence of the Providence sisters. Now, to me, this is an important moment. It may even be a chilling moment because we can see the origins here of what came to be those boarding schools that had such a complicated, in many ways dire effect for indigenous people. To be clear, this does not become a boarding school until, I think, half a year later, something like that. Briefly, I'll just acknowledge that the Providence sisters are participating in a Catholic missionary project that's most associated with Father Pierre Jean de Smet. I'm sure many of you know him. He's extraordinary, and he's so important to our world right now, right? I love this photograph, by the way. Look at that. There's a lot going on there, right? I mean, this is a pretty amazing photograph. He, of course, has the cross, but I love the globe in the background, suggesting that he literally does cover the globe. He is Flemish. He's from Belgium, actually, and he is really gone all over the American West proselytizing. He's most famous for establishing St. Mary's Mission just south of us in 1841. He does something that shocks the Salish, the Bitterroot Salish. He ends up approaching the Blackfeet and trying to convert them. The Salish took that as betrayal. They thought of the Jesuits as protectors against the Blackfeet. When they turned to proselytizing the Blackfeet, well, effectively it means the end of the mission at St. Mary's, and they end up migrating up to St. Ignatius. I have to tell you, Father de Smet is an extraordinary person. And another historian I wanted to recommend, and maybe you've had her, Sally Thompson. Have you had Sally Thompson speak to you? She's amazing. She's writing a book about Father de Smet from the point of view of the native nations, the tribes. And you should bring her in. She's incredible. So she's really good. All right. Now, what else is happening in December 1864? Governor Sidney Edgerton calls the first legislature to order. First of all, what do you make of that? That is Montana's first legislative hall. What do you think of that? That's pretty cool, huh? Edgerton paid for the construction of it, and I don't think he spent a lot of money on that. I'm just speculating. But I think it also tells you a couple things. First of all, he called the legislature to order in Bannock, which is clearly the second city now, right? We saw that image of Virginia City. That's where the action is. That's where the money is. That's where the power is. But, Sidney Edgerton thinks there are too many of those secessionists, those Confederate sympathizers. I'm not going to meet in Virginia City. I'm going to meet on my home ground in Bannock, and that's where they meet. And so he calls together the legislature. It's evenly divided, Republican, Democrat. You would think in that situation he might want to kind of work out compromise or try to encourage people to get along. Listen to this. Although we are far removed from the scene of strife, which is devastating one portion of our country, we cannot be indifferent to the result of the struggle. We are part of the great American nation, and a part of that nation we must ever remain. Her interest, her prosperity and glory must ever be dear to the heart of every loyal man. This unhallowed rebellion had its origin in the lust for power and the insane desire to extend and perpetuate human bondage. What is he doing? He's calling out all the Democrats. He's calling out all those who are opposed to abolition. He's calling out all those who do not agree with him. Needless to say, this legislative session did not go well. It was a very difficult series of negotiations. And by the way, he did not get what he most wanted. Edgerton really did want to have black suffrage, couldn't get that through. And then just very briefly, another key element of his speech, Edgerton says it's time to take the land away from the Indians. Let's convert it to property. Let's shift over. Let's make it available for whites like me to acquire it. All right. The very last day of 1864, December 31st, we discover an astonishing article in the Montana Post. Remember, it's Montana's first newspaper, edited by Thomas Dimsdale. And we discover, believe it or not, Calamity Jane begging on the streets of Virginia City. This is perhaps my favorite photo of her. Of course, she's 20 here. She's not the 8-year-old we're going to meet in a moment. What we know about her family is that her father was a farmer in Missouri, and he basically ran into legal troubles, so the family absconds to Montana. It's an utter disaster. It's an utter disaster. Her father, we think, maybe turned to gambling. Her mother may have actually been forced to go into prostitution. So it is an ugly scene that we're witnessing here on December 31st, 1864. Pamelia and James Ferguson are, to me, some of the most interesting people. I'll just briefly say, James was a Scottish immigrant. He actually tried to build a town on the Mississippi River in Minnesota at Little Falls. Fails, comes west. He and his wife and kids are separated. But in August of 1864, Pamelia and the kids arrive. They have a tough time getting back together, but nonetheless, here they are in Virginia City, and James Ferguson is a county commissioner. This is important context for what we're about to read. So this is the article in the Montana Post, December 31st, 1864. A most flagrant and wanton instance of unnatural conduct on the part of parents to their children came under our notice today. 3 little girls who state their names to be Canary, and you know that's the name for Calamity, appeared at the door of Mr. Fergus on Idaho Street, soliciting charity. The ages of the older ones were about 10 and 12, respectively. Not quite accurate. Martha Jane, that is, Calamity Jane, was about 8. Canary, the father, it seems, is a gambler in Nevada City, just to the north, rather. The mother is woman of the lowest grade. They used to write very colorfully in 1864. As for the inhuman brutes who have deserted their poor, unfortunate children, excuse me, their poor, unfortunate children, the divine anger will overtake them sooner or later. And you probably know a thing or two about Calamity Jane. I will tell you her parents are dead within 2 years. She becomes the caretaker for her siblings. Frankly, she probably does enter into prostitution. She ends up briefly with the Buffalo Bill West show. It doesn't go well. She dies at 47. Pretty tough story. Okay, very quickly. I won't read these passages to you. I'll paraphrase them. So that takes us to the end of 1864. Just a couple of brief afterwards. First of all, this is Molly, or Mary Sheehan, and her father, James. He's an Irish immigrant. Notice this pattern, folks, Irish immigrants. And they'd come to Virginia City, where he is a teamster. She actually witnessed some of the hangings during the height of the vigilantes. But anyway, when Abraham Lincoln dies in April of 1865, she describes how she and other members of her class dance with joy. So if you have any doubt about the intensity of feelings around the Civil War, even at this point, when the Confederates have effectively surrendered, Lincoln has been assassinated, Molly Sheehan, Mary Ronan, right? She's dancing in the schoolhouse with joy. Tough stuff. And then another heartbreaker. This is Victor, head of the Bitterroot Salish. He had negotiated the 1855 Council Grove Treaty, which it was his really very clever effort to protect the Bitterroot Valley for his people. What he is saying here in this letter to, a transcribed letter, a dictated letter to Governor Edgerton is, the whites are taking our land from us in the Bitterroot. You must stop it. But Sidney Edgerton had no interest in stopping it. And remember, he leaves later this year, so Edgerton has nothing to say or do, if you will, with this. But it's just kind of a tragic prologue to what we know happens in 1890 when his son Charlo has to lead the Bitterroot Salish through Missoula, right, up into the Flathead country. So that's my overview. These are my sources. I apologize. That is too small to read, isn't it? I want to assure you they're very good sources. They're very good books. I also had to indicate where I got all these incredible photos. I don't know about you, but preparing a talk, maybe the most fun is finding the best photos. So I hope you enjoy it. So I am now open for questions. I know that went on a little while. So yes, Lee.
How is it that Montana got the land as far west of the Continental Divide as it did, squeezed out of Idaho?
That's such a great question. So the question is, how did Montana basically get where we are? How did Montana get from here to the western border, right? And the truth is, Idaho blew it. Idaho's governor basically was asleep at the switch. That's our best understanding of it. And by the way, you know, those clever men like Wilbur Sanders and Sidney Edgerton and a guy named Francis Thompson and Hezekiah Hosmer, they were clever men, and they were advocating for a new territory. They had their eye on this land. They wanted it. So they just aggressively went for it in committee, and to the best of our knowledge, the Idaho governor just kind of let it go. He didn't respond. He didn't, put up the big protest. I'm glad it happened. So, other questions?
Yes.
I just have a comment. The actual legal name of the Order of Sisters who came was the Sisters of Charity of Providence. And it was changed, I believe, in the 60s, maybe early 70s, because the charity to them just meant, love toward their fellow human. But by the 1960s, it was being interpreted as it's a free hospital. My father was chief financial officer of the hospital at that time, and so that was a driving force, but the original name was of Charity of Providence.
That's very
Excellent. Somebody else wants to. You mentioned that Democrats won the. Democrats just won the representative to Congress. Were territorial reps empowered to vote? What was their status in Congress?
Their status was only to represent. They did not have official power, but they were incredibly important lobbyists.
And basically, that remains in Democratic hands right up through statehood, right? Which tells you again, right? So you have these Republican administrations imposed on Montana.
Voters keep sending Democratic
representatives to Congress. So they're basically lobbyists or advocates for Montana is their function. The most famous of them is a guy named Martin McGinnis. You may have heard of him. I think he served 15 years or something prior to statehood.
I did research here at the library, and I read a lot of obits, death certificates, all that kind of stuff. And there is a lot of Southern influence in this county. And half of Missouri moved to Ravalli County. Yeah. And then the other comment I'd like to make, I would really like to see someone do some work on all of the sisters who served here in Missoula, because they were a major force. And there really isn't one book that really what in their time here. But and get pictures of them and do all of that.
Yep, I absolutely agree with that.
And I'm not a writer, I only research.
So back to your first comment, though,
I will add, Joseph Kinsey Howard.
great book, Montana, High, Wide, and Handsome.
Joseph Kinsey Howard argued that
The way he put it is,
most of Price's army in Missouri emigrated to Montana. And there is some evidence for that. I mean, obviously, the Missouri River flows out of Missouri, comes up into Montana, so there's a natural path, right? The Oregon Trail is cutting through that country. You go along the Oregon Trail and you can cut up into Montana
pretty easily through a variety of routes. So, without a doubt, strong Southern influence.
And like mines live in like
Correct.
area.
Correct.
Same area.
And to be clear, there were definitely rebels who were hoping they could turn Montana into a Confederate state. By the way, that's one reason Thomas Francis Maher got into so much trouble. The poor man had a lot of problems. He was a tired fellow. He was desperately wounded during the Civil War.
He drank way too much, etc. But one of his problems was he truly did not figure out the political situation. He didn't seem to fully grasp that Wilbur Sanders was very serious when he said,
I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Union Republican man, and I don't trust you, Maher. You're a Democrat, you're Irish, you're Catholic, I don't trust you. And it was just shocking to me to go back and research Maher and realize he just didn't get it. So,
But Maher was a Union
He was.
officer, and
He was.
His life for the Union almost.
I absolutely agree with that. There are hints, though, that he was thinking of importing, if you will, a whole bunch of Irish immigrants, which would have offended Sanders for a variety of reasons. Also, he may, we don't know this for sure, may have been part of a movement, the Fenian movement, that thought that Americans, or that the Irish, should attack Canada, spur a war, and that would, in fact, help to break Ireland free. I want to try to explain that logic. So I think Maher scared Sanders in a variety of ways. Yes.
It seems to me that that contingent of Irish came from the canebrakes of the Missouri along with the Matisse under Louis Riel.
Nice.
And he owned all of the land from Lake Superior to Alaska at one point because the governor at Ottawa hadn't come there yet, and he had defended the fort that's just north of the Red River, and he was the heir of the Northwest Company. And so the Matisse for a while owned everything north of the Missouri and from Lake Superior all the way out to Canada for just a short period of time.
And you're reminding me, there's often a very close bond between Irish immigrants and indigenous peoples, by the way. But in terms of the Métis, if you don't know Chris Lattre's work, Chris is right here in River City. Chris is just an incredible guy, a great writer, and Chris is about to bring out a book, another one for your group, bring out a book, A History of the Métis People. And so it'd be fun to visit with Chris about that and just see what Louis Riel, by the way, is one of the most fascinating people in all of Montana history. So I write about him in 1889, and I was...
What's the name?
What's that?
What's the name?
R-I-E-L, Louis Riel. Riel, yeah. So, yeah.
What happened to Sidney Edgerton?
Sidney Edgerton leaves Montana in 1865. His claim was that he was going to go back and get the funds that were owed him, and he never came back.
Yeah, so
He was
Barr
technically-
assumed the governorship. And
So he was the governor technically until, I want to say like June 1866. And then he goes on to a series, my recollection is a series of government posts, and then drifts into private practice. That's kind of my recollection of him. By the way, the photos of him as an older guy are frightening. He's a scary looking guy. So if you do a Google search on Sidney Edgerton, kind of frightening. I don't know what to say. He looked like a biblical prophet. He really did. Kind of intimidating.
I think it would be interesting to change the terminology in the white people was used at that time to say non-native people.
Sure.
And, 20,000 more things. Because of course there were black people and, Spanish people and all kinds of people. But it also changes the power dynamic.
Yeah.
I think that would be interesting.
This is a great point. I'm so glad you said that. Thank you. So it's most correct to say that the immigrants flowing in at 20,000, highly diverse in ethnicity, in race. In fact, one of the very, very worst incidents that occurred around the Vigilantes is shortly after they hanged Plummer, they ended up attacking the cabin of a mixed race, primarily Hispanic man. And I'm not going to describe what happened. It was horrific. And it was a race riot of sorts. And that occurred fairly frequently. And we're not even going to leap ahead to the Chinese who come later. They're actually in place in 1864, but not as prominent, if you will. But anyway, you're absolutely right. Thank you for saying that. That was important. So. All right. Well, thank y'all. There are a few more books here. $10, get you a book. So, if you want.